Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The Coalition for Clean and Fair Elections is best known as Bersih, and no one can really deny the crucial role the movement has played in revolutionizing the political landscape in Malaysia. Now, from 2007 to 2016, this movement brought KL to a standstill 5 different times as protesters thronged the city streets. But we go back to the first Bersih rally on Saturday, the 10th of November at Dataran Merdeka. Now, in hindsight, that first Bersih rally was credited for the seismic shift that occurred in Malaysia's political landscape in the 2008 general election. That was when BN failed to obtain the 2/3 majority for the first time since 1969. Now, while Bersih ostensibly was about electoral reform, their influence went deeper than their demands for free and fair elections. In this book, We Are Marching On, the Inside Story of Bersih 1.0, chronicles how the movement was created and cultivated. Joining me on the show tonight is the author of the book, Danny Lim. He is a freelance journalist and writer who has worked with international media organizations such as the BBC, Al Jazeera and CNN, and he was previously a senior writer for The Edge and The Sun. Danny, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining me.
Hello, Melissa. Thank you for having me on your show.
Okay, Danny, this book, everyone's talking about it, and it's come at the most opportune time with a GE15 just around the corner. I think it's important to read it to remember part of what was such an important moment of Malaysian history, an important, I would say, even a decade of Malaysian history, political history. Can I begin our conversation today with the reasons behind writing the book? What was this impetus to chronicle this first rally? What did you hope to achieve by having it all down on paper?
Yeah, in 2013, I was writing an article about Bersih for a local magazine that took a behind-the-scenes perspective of the origins and operations of Bersih. So I thought I would just interview like 4 or 5 key people and be done with it. But each subsequent interview I did gave me new information, new leads, new insights that for me were intriguing. I mean, each person would tell me, oh, you should talk to this person. The next person would say the same. And is this because the structure of Bersih back then was very much a broad-based collective movement? There wasn't really one dominant personality that pulled the strings. And so I was fascinated by the diversity of the personalities. I mean, you had an Islamist radical Bomo working together with a former director of Biro Tata Negara. You had rebel-rousing college dropouts who just wanted to fight and just wanted to smell tear gas. At the same time, you had various genteel, straight-laced, egghead type of doctors, academics, lawyers who had multiple master's degrees and PhDs. And I mean, I just wondered, how in the world did these people band together? And so I was fascinated by the weird twist of fate that led them to cross paths. And in investigating these personal histories, I found that the background to what inspired and incited them to either join activism or politics were actually the major political events in Malaysia. I mean, this stretched back all the way back to the radical student movement in the 1970s, to Ops Lala in the 1980s, and Rafa Morsi in the 1990s. And so I was fascinated to see how these broad forces of our Malaysian history interacted with these individual lives to all come together at this one converging point. And that's the point where, okay, I knew I just had to write the book. You know, I was simply curious, like, what were their plans? How did they arrive at these key decisions? What were the arguments and conflicts that led them to make these decisions? You know, I was intrigued by the debates and tensions between them. So yeah, the idea of behind this book is that it presents a narrative of how Bersih was created and cultivated, told through the eyes of the insiders and the decision makers.
And Precisely that, Danny. If I may just quickly interrupt, the kaleidoscope of characters that you were describing, I think is what really makes the book shine. Now, I know this isn't a book review show, but I do want to focus a little bit first on why you wrote the book this way. Other writings on Bersih have had a very different treatment of the subject matter, very academic and almost scrutinizing the way political parties were formed from that, the way it impacted the political scene. Yours reads like a crime caper, like a heist novel. Act 1, we get to know these colorful characters. Act 2, we find out the planning of this, and then Act 3, the heist, the heist, if I may, happens, and then we hear about the aftermath. It read like a novel, and I think that was important in your storytelling. Why was it? Why did you choose to write the book this way, as opposed to, say, a more academic approach?
Yeah, I mean, it was completely intentional, and also it's my own interest. I mean, I just was not interested in what was already written out there. What I wanted to achieve was to see if I could write narrative non-fiction that pieced together these elements of Malaysian history and politics. And at the same time, I hope it was journalistically robust and educational and insightful. But I didn't want it to be in that kind of turgid academic way. I wanted it in that way that was an engaging read for the layman. And because in telling the story of these personalities, like you said, the kaleidoscope of personalities, right? It said so much about us, about Malaysia. And so Bersih became kind of a lens through which we could see how these personalities, and to some extent, we were all linked by this shared history.
As I was reading the book, it kind of struck me how quickly time has passed. We're talking about 15 years ago. So let's as we get into the book, Danny, I think you need to set the scene for us. Take us back to 2007. I'm sure many viewers, like myself, can barely remember, and I can barely remember what I had for lunch yesterday, let alone what has happened in the past 15 years. So take us back to 2007. What were the issues that were resonating with people then, politically and economically? What was it about that period that allowed for a movement like Bersih to flourish?
Okay, so 2007 is a bit strange, okay? It didn't seem like anything major was happening. I mean, economically, we weren't doing too badly. I think we still had 6% GDP growth. There was some issues of judicial integrity with the VK Lingam video clip. In fact, the Altantuya murder trial just started in mid-2007. There were some issues of rising crime. And so there were incidences here and there, but there wasn't one or two big events you can pinpoint as a major catalyst that set the scene, right? The way 1997 had the Asian financial crisis and the sacking of Anwar, or like the way 1987 and 88 had Ops Lalang and the constitutional crisis. So I like to quote this line I used to describe 2007 in my book. We were on the brink of change, but we had no clue. So 2007 was the year that the first iPhone was launched. But at the same time, for the vast majority of Malaysians, the internet was still something you had to connect. You had to go home to your desktop and connect from your at your office. Most people didn't have smartphones or mobile phones. But by the next year, a lot of Malaysians were already holding Blackberries. The people mobilizing for the first Bersih rally were essentially doing the same things the people mobilizing for the Reformasi rallies 8 years back. I mean, they were printing and photostating and distributing flyers and going to the ground doing charamas. And yet, within 4 years, the most effective mobilizing tool for the second Bersih rally would be Facebook. And so politically, it was the same. People were generally hopeful for this, like what you call a post-Mahathir era, right? And that's why BN had such a big win for the 2004 general election. But by 2007, the hope and optimism for the Patla administration had kind of deflated. Promising reforms like, for example, the independent police complaints and misconduct commission. I mean, those things were all buried already. So,
Do you think, Danny, do you see any parallels or similarities with that period and the sentiment of the period with 2022, Malaysia of the 2022.
Oh no, 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 not at all. I can. I mean, okay. So 2007, the political scenario was very clear cut, very binary. You had 50 years. I mean, that was the 50th anniversary of Malaysia, and so you had 50 years of unbroken rule by Barisan Nasional, and they had controlled more than 90% of parliamentary seat. I mean, no government has ever had that much control. The only state BN control on the in the peninsula, not controlled by BN on the peninsula was Kelantan. So for the opposition, you had this choice. There was opposition on one side, and this huge hegemonic behemoth on the other side. And so you asking just now, like what are the conditions that led to Bersih to flourish?
Bersih, yeah.
Whatever disappointments and grievances that the people had, it was very easy to focus and blame squarely on Barisan Nasional. Any anger could be directed and channeled at this big hegemonic behemoth, right? And in fact, the people had already given BN a kind of second chance. That second chance was like 2004, because a new prime minister came in, and like Patla offered this hope of like, hey, there could be real change, there could be some reform. And by 2007, this kind of deflated a bit. So by 2008, you either could go with the same old behemoth that ruled for 50 years, or you could pin your hopes on someone new. And now the things you must remember, 2007, and it seems crazy to imagine this, but in 2007 was the first time people saw Anwar Ibrahim campaigning for the opposition, because he was jailed since 1998. And only in 2007 was the first time that he actually went on the ground for some campaigning for by-elections. So Anwar was this kind of like, oh, he's new player here, there's something new here, and there's this new hope. You contrast it today. I mean, come on, the situation is so messy, it's so muddled. You have electorate who's disillusioned, confused. You have multiple coalitions, all who have been in government before, all who can be somewhat blamed, fairly or unfairly, for lack of sufficient reforms.
Yeah, completely different. I hear what you're saying. Danny, we're going to take a quick break, but let's come back and continue this conversation. Still so much to cover. We'll be right back in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Let's continue our discussion with Danny Lim, the author of We Are Marching Now, Inside Bersih 1.0. We're talking about the origins of the first Bersih rally. Danny, you talked a little bit just before the break about the conditions that allowed for a movement like Bersih to rally. And I do want to kind of go into how or what Bersih represented. I know they were really about electoral reform, but what role do you think the first Bersih rally played in the 2008 election results? I mean, that was when it was such a pivotal moment in the Malaysian political history. But how did a Kuala Lumpur-based rally shake the very foundations of the Malaysian political scene?
2008, the main thing was that you must remember the first Bersih, the first iteration of Bersih was very much a political party phase. I mean, it was created and dominated by the politicians. And what was key at that time was that they were facing the great loss of 2004, where they were practically wiped out, right? And so they had to do something, and they were aware that they needed to come together, but it was so difficult for them at that time because just being in the same room together was considered taboo, especially PAS and DAP. And so you had this the imperative, external political imperative to come together, because you had to take on this huge behemoth that was had ruled for 50 years, and at the same time, you had to overcome your own differences. That basically, that's what happened in 2004, where you had three corner fights, because and the three main opposing parties couldn't come together. So Bersih created that safe space because Bersih allowed people to coalesce around a common cause where they could set aside their differences. And they could say, okay, we can stand together here. So that's why the first Bersih rally was so important, because you could actually see at outside the gates of the Istana where people like Kit Siang, Hadi Awang, and Anwar Ibrahim stand together. I mean, that was unheard of 4 or 5 years previously. You know, there was just no way that could happen. And yet now they were showing the world, yes, we're together. And that fed into the 2008 elections, where seat negotiations were described to be very easy because there was a lot of cooperation happening already, and their manifestos were aligned, even though they weren't really formally in a coalition. Yet they kind of like worked in sync. They were not attacking each other the way they did with the previous election, and I would say that that was a major step towards Barisan Nasional losing their 2/3 majority for the first time since 1969. But also, it was the major step towards them forming the Pakatan Rakyat Coalition shortly after the 2008 elections. And you could say that the Pakatan Harapan is the kind of like successor to the Pakatan Rakyat Coalition.
I want to talk a little bit about Bersih's reliance on PAS. And I think that was something that a lot of people maybe have forgotten, or what hasn't been highlighted, as well as you did in this book. You talked a lot about the reliance on PAS and Unit Amal. Can you talk a little bit about how that cooperation or that relationship was pivotal in mobilizing the masses?
Yeah, so Bersih was very pragmatic. I mean, the kind of people that were involved, the kind of ringleaders that are described to be the ones making the key decisions in Bersih, were the type who, like, okay, they understood that that they had to be pragmatic, that they had to get the big numbers. And at that time, the reality is that civil society just didn't have the capacity, it wasn't in their skill set to really get huge numbers of people out in the streets. But PAS was the, they had the numbers, they had the experience, they had done many demonstrations before, sometimes with PKR, or what was known as Keadilan before, for the Reformasi rallies. And so they knew that they had to tap into the grassroots support and machinery of PAS. But even then, they still required the mobilization efforts of a grassroots leader like Mat Sabu. And Mat Sabu and his team had to travel around the peninsula, going from town to town, village to village, conducting traumas, and whipping up enthusiasm for the rally, because his own president at that time, Hadi Awang, was not even interested in even mentioning Bersih. So they had to do a lot of groundwork. And at the same time, Bersih's positioning of having the political parties in collaboration with civil society, having the Malaysian Trades Union Congress president at that time, Syed Muhammad, as the main Bersih spokesperson, also made it more palatable. Together, we would say a wider and more diverse audience.
It's quite amazing, again, because Bersih started out with all these, as you said, the genesis of Bersih is the genesis of Pakatan Rakyat, which led to Pakatan Harapan. But yet Bersih was handed over, in a sense, the baby was handed over to civil society. And I know a lot of people often point to what they perceive as political partisanship of Bersih. Can you talk a little bit about why this was such a contentious issue, and why it's such a misconception among the Malaysian public?
Well, the biggest misconception, and partly also what kind of led me to also investigate this story firstly as an article, was the misconception that, politicians hijacked Bersih. That especially came about after Bersih 2 and Bersih 3. And that time, as a journalist, I kind of knew enough to know that this wasn't quite true. But that's why that got me interested to learn more. And of course, it's very clear. Bersih was created by the politicians, and it was cultivated by them. And it was at the same point that Pakatan Rakyat was born. At the same event, at the same workshop, is the same event that Bersih was born. The idea of a Bersih was born, and it goes hand in hand that the politicians at that time would want to have the same things that the activists, the civil society organization wanted, which was electoral reform. They had their causes were aligned at the time, and you must also remember that a lot of these politicians, which now we regard as this separate species. I mean, like people like Tian Chua, people like Siva Rasa. I mean, they were extremely well-established civil society actors themselves in the 80s and 90s. So their roots were there. So in a way, it's not unusual that an activist turned politician would then want to have be part of and create electoral reform movement.
But it went so much more than electoral reform. I mean, yes, that was the raison d'etre, electoral reform, free and fair elections, but the rallies became so much more than just the core issues of electoral reform, didn't they?
Yes, that's right. Especially the subsequent rallies, especially the fourth and fifth rally, because I would say gradually Bersih was perceived to be an effective channel of public protest. And because Bersih was seen that it could provide a broad enough umbrella to include people who wanted to voice up on causes not directly related to electoral reform. I mean, you had people who were like the Rimbunan Hijau environmentalists, and at the same time you had people who were pushing 1MDB against 1MDB especially for Bersih 4 and 5. And then each subsequent rally, Bersih itself altered and expanded their list of demands to embrace wider issues pertaining to democracy and governance. So this goes back to the foundation of Bersih. In its first iteration, essentially what was it? It was people setting aside their differences to come together for common goals. And so eventually these common goals grew, expanded, and that's why it was a broad enough umbrella.
Right. So, this decision of Bersih for that very first rally, if we cast our mind back, among Malaysian civil society, the decision to go to the streets is never made lightly because of how the government uses the state apparatus to clamp down on protesters. So you said that Bersih was an effective channel of public protest. What do you think, or what do you believe have been the implications of the first Bersih rally and all subsequent Bersih rallies towards to Malaysians' view towards the right to peaceful assembly? How do you think that's evolved over the years because of Bersih?
Oh, so definitely Bersih has been hugely influential as in changing public consciousness regarding these so-called peaceful assemblies, and also it was also influential in changing the way the authorities reacted to peaceful street protests, especially large-scale street protests. I mean, because the people's imagination of a street protest back then was either you had a very small, stationary, kind of like picketing outside a place like an embassy, and you had, and there either that or it was those reformasi rallies that, it seemed very wild and rowdy, and like it seemed there was element of violence to it. And then Bersih came in and kind of like changed the public imagination of what a mass street rally could be, and you could see that most of the Bersih rallies were generally peaceful, and then each rally informed the subsequent rally. So people who went to the first rally would then like tell their friends, and then the next rally by Bersih 2, you could see like there were more people. I literally could see like, I never saw these type of people before. These are not your normal demo types, your normal civil society types or political types. And then by Bersih 3, like, wow, it was more diverse. It was like, I could see like middle class people. You could see, and something that even Mat Sabu mentioned, how like in the reformasi rallies were nearly 99% Malay. Whereas in Bersih, for Bersih, even the first Bersih, you could see a significant increase in the participation of non-Malays. And so you saw this widening in the diversity, and not just in ethnicity, but like I said, the type of people, more middle class, more urban. By Bersih 4 and 5, you saw uncle, auntie types that you never imagined to come anywhere near. I mean, basically 10 years ago, you imagine these very same people to be the type that tell their children don't go to rally, and now you can see them there. And because each Bersih rally made them feel more comfortable, made it more acceptable, and made the idea of like, oh, you can have a peaceful street protest.
Danny, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. I have to say it was an even bigger pleasure reading your book. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. Danny Lim, author of We Are Marching Now, the Inside Story of Bersih 1.0. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.